what if you could build clean and responsive UIs so that you'd never again have to Google how to center a div? Sounds like a dream, right? Well, let's make that dream a reality. I get it. Tutorial after tutorial, you're still struggling with responsive layouts, custom styling, and making the most out of Tailwind CSS. That's exactly why I created this complete and updated Tailwind CSS course. Not just another tutorial, but the one that finally clicks. This isn't your typical, here's a bunch of utility classes video. You don't fully understand how Tailwind works behind the scenes, aren't sure if you're following the best practices, struggle with dark mode, theming, or custom styles, feel lost when using pseudo classes, media queries, or dynamic utilities, rely on JavaScript for things that Tailwind can handle natively, or maybe you just want to master Tailwind CSS instead of just messing with it. Then you are the one I created this course for. By the end of this free YouTube tutorial, you won't be just copying and pasting classes. You'll understand exactly how and why they work while mastering Tailwind's fundamentals. You'll learn how to structure Tailwind CSS projects the right way, the key principles behind utility-first styling, a complete guide to responsive layouts, how to implement dark mode and custom themes, and a bunch of pro tips to speed up your workflow. But that's just part one. Very soon, the entire course and much more will be available as a structured, lesson-based experience on our brand new platform, JS Mastery Pro. Over there, you'll find quizzes, interactive exercises, additional deep dives, and you'll also get access to the full Build and Deploy section where we take everything you've learned and build a fully responsive, professional landing page from scratch. You'll build a sleek navbar and a hero section, a trusted by companies section, a detailed how it works breakdown, testimonials and impressive stats, a powerful call to action, and a polished footer with a full light and dark mode support. And depending on when you're watching this, you can either join the waitlist or, if you're lucky, jump right in and start learning on JS Mastery Pro. The link is in the description. So, whether you're a complete beginner or an experienced developer looking to master Tailwind, this course will take you from what's a utility class to watch me build this complex layout in minutes. So, what are you waiting for? Let's dive right in and master one of the most essential skills in modern web development. Tailwind CSS isn't just another styling framework. It's a utility-first ideology that makes building modern, responsive websites faster and easier. Unlike Bootstrap, Design, or Material UI, which come with predefined components and styles, Tailwind gives you complete control through small, reusable utility classes. So instead of writing custom CSS from scratch, you can simply combine these classes to style your site exactly how you want. This approach has completely transformed the way developers write CSS. Sure, UI kits are great at first, but tweaking them to match your design, that's a headache. Let's be honest. Default UI component libraries stick out like fast food menus. They work, but they all look the same. Tailwind, on the other hand, is like a fully stocked kitchen. It gives you the ingredients, not the prepackaged meal. No more rigid, no more cookie-cutter designs. You get the flexibility to customize everything while keeping your codebase clean and maintainable. Still, if you want to use some ready-made components, Tailwind's ecosystem has exploded with component libraries that support it. Everything from Tailwind UI and Headless UI, and of course everyone's favorite, ShotCN. These libraries let you build UIs faster than ever without sacrificing customization. But do real companies actually use Tailwind? Absolutely. From OpenAI to Shopify, Loom, The Verge, Turbo, GitHub, Microsoft, and even NASA, Tailwind CSS is the go-to choice for many big companies. The official example showcase highlights some of the biggest brands using Tailwind CSS in production. So, are you ready to take your styling game to the next level? Let's dive right in. So, how does Tailwind CSS actually work? Before we dive in, let's quickly compare traditional CSS with Tailwind's utility-first approach. So, how do we normally write CSS? Well, we create some elements and assign them CSS classes. Something like a div with a container and an h1 with a container heading. And then we define those classes in CSS, dot container, give it a display flex, justify content center, you know the drill. And you can also style the heading. Here, container and container headings are just custom classes with predefined styles. But now let's rethink that with a utility-first mindset. What if instead of writing custom class names, we broke styles into small, reusable utility classes? Something like .flex will set a display of flex, item center will set the align items to center, and so on. You can do the same thing for colors or even font sizes. With these utilities in place, we can now structure our HTML like this. You can create a div and give it class names of flex, justify center, item center. And the same thing goes with a p tag. See the difference? We're still using classes, but instead of defining custom class names, we're composing styles directly with utility classes. And this is exactly how Tailwind CSS works. Every Tailwind class is just a predefined CSS rule. For example, when we use flex, Tailwind generates that property behind the scenes. And I get how this might feel like just a lot of extra work, but trust me, it'll save you hours because you won't have to worry about class names, structuring styles with the BEM methodology, or managing gigantic CSS files. You can just use the utilities and Tailwind does the rest. But Tailwind simplicity is also a cause for a lot of misconceptions around it. There's a common myth when talking about Tailwind, and that is, aren't all of these just inline styles? We're basically writing everything on a single tag, inline. So why can't we use just a regular CSS, applying a style property with a padding of 10 and a color of blue? Well, it's not really the same, because this doesn't allow you to use more advanced properties like pseudo classes, which we'll explore later on, and they also don't give you access to media queries. But even more importantly, inline styles cannot be reused. You have to rewrite them on every single element where you need them. But Tailwind CSS utility classes, on the other hand, are completely reusable, which means that you can create a small set of reusable CSS classes and then use them on whichever element you want across the entire application. Hopefully, you will never again think that Tailwind is the same as inline styles, and you're actually excited to see what more it brings to the table. So let's dive deeper into this crash course so that very soon you can build a real-world project so you can truly master it. Before we dive into complex layouts, let's start with Tailwind Play, an interactive online playground for testing Tailwind CSS styles. I'll put the link to it down below this lesson, and once you're there, you can delete all of the pre-generated code. Instead, let's start with a basic hello world. So far, super plain and super boring. So let's bring Tailwind into the mix. As I already mentioned, Tailwind provides a set of predefined utility classes to style elements without having to write custom CSS. For example, we can very easily style this h1. Just start by giving it a class and start typing text dash. And immediately, you'll see a dropdown with all of the related utilities. This will include alignment, font sizes, colors, and more, making it super easy to explore and apply all of these different styles. So let's apply a property of text-center, text-lg, as well as text-blue-400. And just so we don't have to stare at this white screen while everything else is dark, I'll put it right below and head over into CSS and target the body element by giving it a background color. 10172A is this nice Tailwind CSS color. And now if you want to apply some kind of a margin to this text element, you can say margin top 2 maybe, which will apply a slight margin to push it from the top, and you can easily change the text color to something like cyan 400. That's looking great. But now the main question is, how does Tailwind CSS actually work behind the scenes? Well, at the bottom here, there's a generated CSS tab. Click on it and it'll expand. Here, you can find different sections. All includes everything Tailwind generates, including default styles and theme-based utilities. Next, there's theme, which contains the Tailwind CSS built-in theme variables like colors, spacing, and more. There's base, which includes global styles like removing default margins from the body element. And then there's the custom component styles. I'll teach you how that works later. And finally, the most important part, which are the utilities. It contains the actual CSS generated for each utility that you use. For example, right now in our HTML, we have only text center, text LG, cyan 400, and margin top of 2. So let's see how each one of these utility classes looks like when converted to plain CSS. MT2 applies a margin top where they calculate some kind of a spacing here. This is super nice because they're using CSS variables to make the whole system super modular. They're not using absolute values. Text center simply applies a text align property of center. Text LG not only changes the font size, which is what you would assume, but also modifies the line height to make it look better. And then cyan 400 simply changes the color. So if you quickly change this color from cyan to maybe something like green, you can see that it automatically gets replaced with another style right here. And what that means is that Tailwind CSS generates styles on the fly, only for the classes we actually use. This keeps our CSS lean and efficient. Think of it like a Thanos finger snap. Change a class and the styles adjust instantly. Now, let's continue experimenting with some background colors, spacings, font styles, and borders. Create a new div element that'll wrap the H1 that we have right here. That'll look something like this, and we can indent it properly. Now, we can apply a class to this div and give it a bg-violet-200 color. We can also give it an h of 10 for the height, a w full, so it takes the full width of the container, border-2, border-violet-600, rounded-md to round up the corners a bit, margin y of 4 to divide it a bit from the top and bottom, and padding of 2. We can also change the H1 a bit by giving it a font of mono, font-extra bold. And there we go. It says hello world. And we never entered another file. We did everything within this HTML, or later on this will be JSX or even TSX file, because Tailwind is widely used in React and Next.js. So let me actually break down what happened here. wfull and h10 are width and height properties. The full simply sets the width to 100% of the container, and h10 simply provides about 2.5 rem or about 40 pixels of height. bg-violet-200 applies a background color, and 200 stands for a shade of that color. Next, border-2 and border-violet-600 simply apply a border, first by giving it a border width, and of course, this gives it a border color. Rounded MD applies a medium border radius to make the corners rounded. Margin Y of 4 is interesting. It applies a margin, but why margin Y? Well, you could have done margin top, which would apply something on the top. You could do margin left for left, right for right, or bottom for bottom. Or you can use Y for top and bottom, like Y-axis, or X for left and right. It's super flexible. The full notation looks something like this. You say M, and then you can either apply top, right, bottom, left, or Y or X, and then the size you want to apply it. And the same thing goes with the padding. You can say padding, top, bottom, left, right, X, Y, whatever you want to do, or if you don't apply anything, it'll apply it on all sides. Finally, we have text center, which you already know what it does. Font simply applies a font family, and this changes the font weight. And while we're here, we can also have a quick lesson on margins and paddings. Many developers confuse the two. Margin is an external spacing, which pushes the element away from others, while padding is internal spacing, so it adds space inside of an element. So if I put this on the right side, so it's easier to see what's happening, and if I increase margin Y to something like 10, you'll see that it pushes more from top, but also from the bottom, even though we cannot see it. And if I increase the padding to something like padding of 6, you'll see that it adds more internal space. But now, if we truly want to center this text, we also need to make this div a flex container and give it a justify center, as well as items center properties. There we go. So now you know a bit more about different types of properties that we can apply to different elements using Tailwind. The possibilities are really endless, and even though it might seem like I'm coming up with these names off the top of my head, memorizing them is super simple once you get the hang of it. And of course, another pro tip is if you want to figure out what the actual CSS value of a specific property is, just hover over it and you'll see exactly what it does. They even provided this nice comment to tell you exactly how many rems or pixels padding of 6 applies. This was simple and fairly high level. But in the next lesson, I'll let you know the Tailwind superpower. Tailwind CSS isn't just about predefined utility classes. It's also incredibly flexible thanks to its just-in-time compiler, also known as JIT. The JIT compiler generates styles on demand, which means that Tailwind only includes the exact styles your project uses, keeping your final CSS small and efficient. For example, let's say you want to rename this h1 to jsmastery.pro, which is the URL of a code platform we've been building for months that allows you to create custom learning paths. And also, let's say you want to give it a font size of something like 13 pixels, which is not a predefined Tailwind utility. Normally, you would have to create an inline style or give it a custom class, but with the JIT compiler, you can do this instead. Text-13 pixels within square brackets, just like this. Or you can do something like 20 or even 30. It is completely up to you. Any value you want, you can apply it automatically, and the JIT compiler will add it to the generated CSS, removing all the unused style, only keeping the used ones, keeping your CSS bundle as small as possible. So why is this JIT compiler such a big thing? Well, first of all, because it optimizes performance, generating only what you need. It gives you faster build times because it doesn't need to pre-compile thousands of different classes. It supports arbitrary values, which means that you can pass any custom size, color, or property to make your website super unique. And it works seamlessly in both development and production. And the best part is that it is completely built into Tailwind by default without any extra setup. So now that you understand the core mechanics behind how Tailwind CSS works, let's move on to layouts and flexbox, because knowing how to style elements is useless if you don't know how to position them. Tailwind provides powerful utilities for structuring layouts with positioning, display properties, flexbox, and grid. So let's go over them one by one. Most of the time, you'll see yourself using display, position, and maybe sometimes overflow CSS properties. So let's first talk about positioning. Positioning defines where an element appears relative to its container or the viewport. There's a position of relative, which moves the element relative to its normal position. Then there's absolute, which moves it to the nearest parent. There's also a fixed position, which sticks the element to the viewport so it doesn't scroll, as well as position sticky, which makes it behave normally until scrolled to a certain point. For example, if you create a red 10 by 10 square and you give it a top 0 property, it'll be fixed at the top of the page regardless of your scroll position. Then, much more important than position, there's display and specifically flexbox in Tailwind. It determines how an element behaves in terms of layout and visibility within the document. It's one of those must-have CSS skills for creating responsive layouts, and the moment you master flex, well, you can flex on everyone. There's display block, which simply takes up the full width. There's display inline, which behaves like text, which means that it doesn't have any width or height. And finally, there are two very powerful display properties. The first one is flex, which enables flexbox, and the second one is display grid, which enables the CSS grid properties. So let's start by exploring flexbox in action. I'll create a new div that has a class equal to flex, which just enables flexbox. Then I'll give it justify-end, which will align the items within the container to the right. And finally, space-x-6, which will add some spacing in between the elements. So let's add that inner element of div, and we can also just immediately close it. I'll give it a class equal to h of 16 for the height, w of 16 for the width, rounded-full to make it into a circle, and a bg of blue 500. Now I'll duplicate this div right below 2 times. And immediately you'll see 3 different circles. Let's also apply a bit of a margin top of 2 to give them some space. And let's change the colors. Let's go with blue, orange, and green. There we go. Oh, and it looks like I almost remade the letterbox logo. That was fun. But hey, just by putting these 3 different divs right here, you can play with the flex layout. Maybe change it from justify end to justify around, baseline, between, center, end, evenly, whatever you want to do, you can totally do it and see it happening live right here. But what if you want to have a column-based layout where the elements are not one next to another, but rather one on top of the other? Well, you can do that very easily by assigning it a flex-col property, which stands for column. And of course, if you want to modify how the elements appear on a column, instead of using justify properties, you can use items-properties. So you can center them, end them, start them, stretch them. You can do whatever you want with it. For now, I can just put justify center, item center as well, and give it a space y of 6 instead of x of 6. And now we have 3 vertical circles. Now these circles could be anything. They could be divs, they could be images. You're free to move the content however you'd like across the screen, allowing you to create any kind of layout. Even this Tailwind screen that you're seeing right now is just a series of rectangles. In CSS, everything is a rectangle. See this part right here? Well, it's a rectangle. This preview window, also a rectangle. This button, well, I think you can guess it. And that's exactly what makes Flexbox positioning super useful. And if you want to practice some Flexbox or learn it for the first time, there's a game called Flexbox Froggy that helps you learn Flexbox. The goal of the game is simple. You just have to move the frog from water to its pond. So in this case, you need to apply a justify content of flex end. And trust me, the levels get much more difficult, so you'll have to really practice it and know your way around it. This is a property that we used not that long ago. It's justify content space around. Okay, it's good. My CSS game is still on point. Now, let's practice some CSS grid within Tailwind. Transforming this code to a CSS grid is super simple. Let's just remove the flex and flex-col properties, as well as the item center and justify center. Heck, we can remove everything. And let's just apply a grid property, as well as grid-cols-3, which stands for 3 columns. And we can also apply a gap of 2 in between the elements. We can also give it a margin top of 2 to divide it from the top, and a margin x of 2 to divide it from the corners. Now, what's cool about this grid is that if you don't provide it the width, it'll naturally expand to fill its space. You can do similar things with Flexbox, but grid makes it super simple to fill out the entire width or height of something. So, in simple words, this code right here creates a 3-column layout. You can change it to something like 5, which will make it a 5-column layout, giving us space for 2 more elements. As with Flexbox, there's many other grid properties that you can use, from columns, rows, flows, and more, to truly master it. And if you're new to CSS Grid, well, there's no frogs here, but a grid garden. It works very similarly to Flexbox Froggy, but it doesn't have as good of a name. Here, you can move different things around to grow your garden. So with that in mind, you now know the basics of how we can position your elements within a layout using grid and Flexbox in Tailwind CSS. Of course, these are just native CSS properties, but Tailwind makes it super simple to use them. How to make your websites look good on all different kinds of devices? Well, Tailwind makes responsive design easy by using mobile-first breakpoints. It gives you a set of predefined device widths, ranging from small, medium, and large to extra large. What's cool about them is that by default, they set a min width, which means that it sets styles for a specific screen width or larger, not smaller, okay? That means that we're talking about a mobile-first methodology. Still, you're open to use something known as a max width to set up styles for a specific screen width or smaller. But as I said, Tailwind is mobile first, so the min width queries will be applied by default. Now, let me show you how that works in practice. Let's say that we have a div, and that div will render a p tag that'll say something like, I appear on screens wider than 768 pixels. Let's also give it a class equal to text-white. Perfect, here it is. Now, how would we actually make this piece of text do what it says it's gonna do? Well, very easily. By giving this outer div a class of medium devices block, but typically hidden. So what this means is that we will apply a display of none, but only on medium devices where media width is greater than or equal to 48 rem, which is about 770 pixels. Then we change the display to block. So now if I move this around a bit, you can see the width on the top right. And if I expand it over 768 pixels, there we go. You can see that it appears right here. So these two characters in a column right here are what's called a media query. Media queries allow you to change CSS properties depending on the screen width. Now, on top of being able to change the display properties of certain elements, using media queries, you can change whatever you want. So let me make this always visible, but let's change the text background color depending on different screen sizes. We start with small, and on small, we can give it a background of something like, well, you know what? We can already start with these predefined colors. I'll go from 500 all the way until the end. So let's start with 500. And now if we go over 640 pixels, you'll be able to see it right here. But what happens if we change it to medium, something like BG Amber of 700? Well, then if you go even wider, you'll see that it'll change once again. So there's one thing that we can deduct from this, and that is that larger screen sizes will always override the smaller ones. Even though here it says that the width has to be greater than 40 rems, which it is in this case as well, but still, this one is not being applied because the medium one is being applied because it's greater than 48 rems, even though both of them are true. But you can also flip it around on its head by using the max width media queries. As I said, by default, Tailwind uses min width, but if you say max SM or if you say max MD, then it'll be applying that only if the width is lower than that specific size. So now you can see that currently it's like this, but then we increase it, it changes again. So you have two different ways of targeting different elements. Tailwind's doc page on this is super useful. You can see the different breakpoints that they recommend, and you have a couple of examples of a simple marketing page component that uses a stack layout on a small screen and a side-by-side layout on larger screens, which means that you have full control over how it works. The only thing you have to do is play with the media queries. They even give you a full explanation of that example. And right below, they mentioned the mobile-first approach that I was telling you about. This means that unprefixed utilities, like uppercase, take effect on all screen sizes, while prefixed utilities, like empty uppercase, only take effect on specified breakpoint, the end above being the keyword right here. So getting back to our example, without using the max prefix, just using the regular small and medium, small will only work on small and above, and medium will only work on medium and above. Keep that in mind. If there's only one thing you take away from this lesson, then it's that Tailwind uses a mobile-first approach, and it looks at the media query and above. Or if you want to switch it around, then you apply a max before it. And I might be repeating myself a bit here, but I think it's important to dive a bit deeper into this. Because while it doesn't click, it's going to feel weird. So Tailwind even has another section on it. What surprises people the most about the mobile-first approach is that to style something for mobile, you need to use the unprefixed version of a utility, not the small prefix version. Don't think of small as on small screens. Think of it as at the small breakpoint. So do not use small to target mobile devices because this will only center text on screens 640 and wider, not on small screens. Rather, use unprefixed utilities to immediately target mobile by default, okay? So the text will center on mobile by default, and then only change it if you want to change it for larger devices. And I think this dives right into the reason of what mobile-first approach means in the first place, and that is that it's a good idea to implement the mobile layout for a design first, and then layer on any changes that make sense for small screens, followed by medium screens, and so on. And of course, it's super important to mention that you can fully customize your breakpoints. If you want to make sure that it works on specific types of devices or your specific layout breaks on specific widths, well, you can fully customize the exact breakpoints you want to add, such as extra small or even XXL. And remember the just-in-time compiler? It allows you to provide arbitrary values, which means that you can say min 320 pixels and then apply something for that specific screen width. Pretty cool, right? Well, with that in mind, you know more about media queries than most people out there. So put it to good use and remember to design and develop mobile first. Apparently, we developers love dark mode. A recent study on Medium.com reveals that more than 70% of software engineers decide to use the dark mode theme for their IDEs. But it's not just the IDEs. We love dark websites too. So let me teach you how to apply styles for different themes like light and dark mode. Tailwind supports dark mode natively. You just have to add the dark keyword before a class. Let me show you. I'll create a div, and this div will have a class equal to bg white, and in there I can say something like dark mode disabled because it's white, right? But now the only thing I have to do is say on dark mode, apply a background of black. And with that, we have technically enabled our dark mode, but we cannot see the text. So what do we have to do? Well, by default, we can make the text black, but on dark mode, we can make it white by saying text-white. And with that, our dark mode is working. And the way it knows that I want to have my dark mode enabled is based on system or browser preferences. So on your operating system or in your browser, you can try to switch to light mode. My eyes hurt. And immediately you'll see that this part also got changed to white. Or if I decide to switch to dark mode, that's much better. This has changed immediately, just by prefixing the dark properties. But now, often in our websites, you'll also have to create your own toggle to allow the weirdos to switch to the light mode. Just kidding, I like using it sometimes too. So to make this work, we'll have to modify the configuration to include a special dark class. There are two ways to toggle the dark mode manually. You can use the prefers color scheme and override the dark variant to use your custom selector, or you can use something known as a data attribute to automatically activate the theme. For this demo, I'll go with the toggling dark mode manually approach that allows us to add custom directives in the CSS file just above the theme directive. So let me copy this part right here, and back in our playground, I'll head over to CSS and I'll add the add custom variant of dark where .dark and .dark everything turns on the dark mode. If we don't specify this, the theme will automatically adapt based on the user's operating system. Pretty cool, right? You only need to mention this if you want to allow users to switch between the themes on their websites. It's a choice you can give them. So whatever utilities or styles Tailwind provides, just add the dark before them, and you're all set. Those utilities will only take effect when the theme is set to dark. Otherwise, they won't have any impact. Now, I prepared a very quick code example, which I'll give access to somewhere below this lesson or within the GitHub README of this project, where we have a card, and within that card, we have an H3 and a P tag, as well as a button. This button has a manual JavaScript on-click handler, which simply adds a class of dark. This then targets the DOM and applies that class of dark to the browser. So now, if you click it, you can see that we can toggle it on or off, and no longer is our theme based on these system preferences. Rather, we now have an actual toggle that allows us to switch between the different themes. Now, you can also notice there are some weird properties here, like ring 1 or ring slate 900. Heck, there's also a shadow that we added to this element. What are these properties? Well, these are some special utility classes. Shadows allow you to, very quickly add a shadow to a specific element. And trust me, I don't want to teach you what each and every single property does. This lesson would be too long and you wouldn't remember any of it. Instead, if you head over to Tailwind CSS, press Command K and search for any of these properties, you can immediately see what it does. Just click right here, and there we go. Drop shadow MD, LG, and XL. You can see it visually, and it'll even explain what it does and exactly how it works, alongside with a full reference guide to different possibilities that you have with it. Other than that, if you really want to learn how it works behind the scenes, you can head over to the generated CSS and find it right here. Shadow XL basically applies a box shadow with predefined values. So to recap, if you want to manually toggle on or off the dark theme mode, then you can add this custom variant dark and then manually modify it using JavaScript or React. Or if you want to develop for both, but not allow the switch, rather take into the consideration their system preferences, you can just normally say which values you want on the light mode, and then prefix the dark for the same values on the dark mode. Pretty cool, right? Hopefully now you know how you can implement dark themes to make the developers happy. Tailwind makes our life easy, but just how customizable is it? I already told you that you can make everything fully custom. But let's say you want to introduce a new color that isn't present in the default Tailwind CSS theme. You can achieve that in a couple of different ways. So let me go over different methods one by one. First, you can do it inline. Whatever the value is, just put it inside square brackets. Like if you have a p tag with a specific background and padding, and you want to get to a specific text, you can just say text dash, and then within square brackets, define the value. You can see that that value can be any of the millions of colors available for you to choose. It might be even better to change it like this, because backgrounds are also fully customizable. You can say bg dash, and then simply open up a hexadecimal value, allowing you to choose between any of the available colors. Pretty cool, right? But it's not just for colors. You can use it for any utility class. Let's say you want to have custom font sizes or custom paddings. You just do this. p-16 pixels, text-36 pixels, something like that. You can do whatever you want. You already know how to apply custom colors and more. Whenever you want to add something custom or arbitrary, just add the right value within the square brackets. Still, this has some disadvantages. You'll soon notice that this is only for the small tasks. As you add more sections to your app, it simply doesn't make sense to provide custom values for every single piece of text. Now imagine you're using the same color in multiple files, and then your boss or manager or somebody tells you to modify it to something else. Imagine just the number of files and different places where you just have to change a simple value. It's not ideal. So this is the moment where the Tailwind config becomes super relevant. It will enable you to control and organize the entire visual style of your application. The procedure is simple. Simply head over to your CSS file and use something known as Tailwind CSS directives to write any config you want. This is one of the biggest changes that came in Tailwind CSS v4. It completely shifts the approach of configuring your project in a JavaScript file and allows you to configure it directly within CSS. So how exactly can you do it? Well, just head over into your CSS file and modify the theme directive. For example, let's say you want to add this chestnut color. You can do that very easily by saying --color -chestnut, and you can give it a value of whatever value we used right here. Let's use this one. Oh, we're in CSS, so I don't have to wrap it in string signs. That's good to know. And now, if you go back, instead of manually defining the value, you can just say text-chestnut, and you can see that it still uses the same color. Pretty cool, right? So now, if you have to change this value across tens of thousands of files, you only have to change it once. Within the CSS file, if you change the value, it'll completely change everywhere else. So if you check out the theme tab within generated CSS and search for your newly added color, you can see it right here as a single line of code. And as you expected, for this to work, there has to be a specific rule or syntax of what should be configured in which way. For example, colors are defined by prefixing them with --color and then a name, and a custom font can be introduced by something like --font, and then you can define the size. You can read about all of these different namespaces within the Tailwind CSS docs. You can change anything from colors, fonts, text sizes, breakpoints, containers, blurs, animations, and more. But there's another way in which you can make your custom styling even more reusable. Remember the dark mode example, where we created long styles on a simple tag. This may happen when you're building large applications. Cluttering the layouts with these utilities won't be that good from the clean code perspective. For example, just check out this button. It's a simple button, but has a very long class name, as it has some very cool hover and active effects. No one likes to see such a long line of code for a simple button. And now imagine you have to use this button across 10 different files. That would be a mess. So how can you avoid such cases while still having that flexibility that Tailwind CSS gives you? Well, there are a couple of solutions. First, you could break your layouts into specific components. Instead of writing everything in a single page, you can create a separate component for that button and then just call it in a single line. The second step is to use directives. Remember those base, components, and utilities tabs? Tailwind CSS offers directives for each of these to define specific styles. But what does this mean, base, components, and utilities? Well, these are parts of an approach to structuring and organizing styles using the configuration file method. Base simply applies styles globally across your project. For your elements like h1 tags or p tags, you might want to have a specific style which you want to use across the entire page so you can define how a base heading should look like. There's also the components part, which is used to style specific components or reusable UI elements like cards, footers, and more. And then there's utilities, which are atomic styles for individual properties like margins, paddings, typography, colors, and more. And there's another directive called @apply that inserts Tailwind CSS styles into CSS. We also have the add layer, and using these, we can create custom styles for base, components, and utilities. Let me show you how we can do that by heading over into our CSS, and right below the theme, I'll say add layer, components, and I'll define a card component, within which I will @apply a margin of 10, rounded -LG, as well as a BG white. For now, I'm fine with just these three properties. So if we go back to the HTML here and remember our dark mode toggle example, there's a lot of class names right here on this div, such as margin of 10, rounded LG, and BG white. So let's say that we want to take all of these classes. I'll take them and I'll apply them over this card properties, because cards typically have similar margins, rounded corners, backgrounds, paddings, and shadows. So most likely we want to create it as a special layer component of card. And now this would significantly change the way that we ask Tailwind to apply those classes. Instead of mentioning them one by one, you can now simply say card, and this will automatically apply all of those Tailwind utility classes. Pretty cool, right? And you could do that with buttons, h3s, and p tags as well. This was the layer of components, but there's also a layer of base, as I explained. And this allows you to automatically target specific elements, like h1s, where you can say that h1 will, for example, have these properties. So let me copy them. Oh, it's not actually h1, it's an h3 in this case. And I can just say @apply and mention these properties. And we can do a similar thing for the p tag. So I'll take it and define these by applying specific p tag properties. And we can do the same thing for the button even. So let me take these and add them to the button. Of course, don't forget the keyword of apply. We also need semicolons as we're back in CSS. I tend to forget that often. And now back in HTML, check this out. Not only do I not even have to say something like class of h3, I can remove the class entirely, because the h3 by default will get all of these properties applied to it. I can do the same thing with the p tag and even the button. This is pretty amazing, right? You get from a huge mess of inline CSS to everything baked right into your Tailwind CSS configuration. But sometimes these elements will still have to differ a tiny bit, but you might want to make your life a bit easier. So let's say you want to achieve a middle ground. Make your life easier through the Tailwind config, but still not make it always have the default styles. You can do that by defining your own utility styles. By saying @utility, for example, flex center, which is something that we use quite often, you can apply properties of flex, because we need to make it into a flex container, justify -center, as well as items -center. This would allow you to completely center a specific element within the div. These are three different classes, which right now you can apply with just a single one, flex center. So now if I give it a class of flex center, take a look at this. It applies all of these properties together, and there we go. All of the properties are applied with a single class name. Doesn't look that good, but it gets the job done. That's the magic of it. A lot of people don't realize just how useful these directives are and just complain that Tailwind CSS makes their code look messy. Maybe they just want to rant about something on X. Anyway, moving on, there's also another way of improving your Tailwind CSS game, and that is to use component libraries like shadcn. It already comes with a set of predefined components, like buttons for example, that behaves nice, looks nice, and has some default styles. You can very easily grab the code, because it's just that, a button. But behind the scenes, shadcn will set up Tailwind CSS for you and automatically create different variants of the button you can use. So you can style it further if you want to. So you can use it as a default button by just importing different elements from ShatCN and giving them some variants. But the best thing about it is, if you want to give it a class name and change its color, you can just use native Tailwind here as well by saying class name text-red 500, and it will apply that Tailwind CSS style to an already themed button. Pretty cool, right? It just allows you to do so much more in less time while still keeping everything customizable. Because let's be honest, these are very default looking components. Buttons, breadcrumbs, avatars, aspect ratios, these are super plain and simple. Boring even, right? But the beauty of it, considering that it has been built on top of Tailwind, is that you can add colors and make it yours by completely customizing every single bit of it. Sorry for making your eyes bleed there for a second, but I think you get the idea. Tailwind CSS is super flexible and doesn't require you to just write all the styles in line. It allows you to be as specific as you want by choosing arbitrary values or by defining how smaller or bigger parts of your entire application will look like by default. This was such a cool lesson that I believe not a lot of people cover when talking about Tailwind, and I loved recording it. So if you find it useful, I would appreciate it so much if you could click the Trustpilot link below this lesson and leave a nice review. I'm so close to getting to that 4.9 stars, and together we can make it happen. And like Tyron that bought a couple of our courses and recently landed a massive job in a couple of months, well, you can do that too. Thank you so much. So don't be the guy that rants on X about how Tailwind CSS is not customizable. It is, and you don't have to write everything in line. Now you know that, and you just have to figure out a way that works for you. Great job. Now that you understand what Tailwind is and how it works, I want to teach you a couple of Tailwind CSS tips and tricks. The ones that I struggled with and the ones that most people have no idea about. First, let's explore a couple of special utilities. Did you know that you can change the default accent browser color for elements like checkboxes and radio groups? The only thing you have to do is provide a class of accent and then choose a color which you want to add, which gives you a completely customized look of even the tiniest bits like checkboxes. And usually when building a responsive website, these were the accents. So I'll add a comment right here saying accent. And this was just the first trick of many. So let me show you the second one. It'll be all about fluid texts. So usually when building a responsive website, you have to take care of the text size on different devices. You'll have to do something like this, like change the size on different breakpoints. So it's bigger on larger devices and smaller on smaller devices. But did you know that there's also a custom style approach that you can use here? Something like this, text min 10 VW and 70 pixels. So how this works is it is entirely fluid. I mean, just check this out. Whereas this first example changed only 2 times. It is fairly big for a long time, and then even bigger. What you can do with this fluid approach is change it every single pixel that the screen size changes. Pretty amazing, right? Much smoother and more responsive. Instead of relying on the media query, we kind of calculate the value depending on the screen size automatically. The third thing I want to talk about is the file. If you worked with file inputs, you know the pain of styling a default layout. You might need to use a fully custom library or set the input display to none and then create your own. Tricky, isn't it? Thankfully, Tailwind provides a better solution. It looks something like this. You can define a label, and within it, you can define an input. And then the only thing you have to do is use the file prefix, which automatically applies all the customizations to the input. The next step is all about highlights. Let's say you want to override the default blue or other highlight that appears when a user selects a text on the screen. Well, Tailwind CSS gives you a very simple solution to that. Check this out. By default, when you hover, it is blue. But by using a selection property, you can very easily change how it looks like. Now it is green. You simply had to apply a class of BG green. But if you weren't using Tailwind and you wanted to do this with manual CSS, well, you would have to write this kind of messy code. This makes it so simple to be more creative and do whatever you want, because you have complete control just by writing a few lines of code. Now, another pro tip I want to give you is about writing less JavaScript. Well, yeah, if you take the time to learn it well, you can perform so many tasks that are typically done using JavaScript with Tailwind CSS alone. Sounds pretty crazy, right? But think about how often you've made an accordion or relied on a library or states to manage it. Doing something like that with Tailwind is super simple. Check this out. You can use the HTML5 details and summary components, and then apply some kind of an open prefix selector, and it just works by default. Well, this is pretty crazy. You can also modify the color of the caret. Check this out. It is pink. See this thing right here popping in and out, letting me know where my cursor is? Well, that is called a caret, if you didn't know, and you can make it any color you want. And I want to say these were just some examples that shows just how of a unique tool Tailwind CSS really is. There's even more, like before and active states, styles that only work on certain screen sizes like landscape or portrait, styles for area and screen readers, gradients, animations, and it even lets you apply styles when printing your website. Covering all of these would be another course on its own. So I've put together a reference guide with some of the best tips and tricks to bring you to the pro Tailwind developer. For now, it's completely free and linked below this lesson. So simply grab it while you can and store it somewhere. So the next time you're doing something cool with Tailwind, you can always refer to it. It'll also help with one of the biggest problems that people experience when first diving into Tailwind. And that is, how on earth do you remember all those Tailwind classes? I can't even recall what I wrote 2 minutes ago. Well, let me tell you a little secret. You don't have to memorize every single class. As you keep working with Tailwind, you develop muscle memory. It's like riding a bike or tying your shoes. You'll naturally know which classes to use for different elements. Just keep practicing, and before you know it, Tailwind's classes will become second nature to you. You might wonder how you'll manage to write all of these classes while learning without watching any tutorials, but have no fear. The last pro tip I can give you is to just head over to Tailwind CSS, press Command K, and start typing. Whether you're trying to find a specific CSS property, such as border radius, and you're wondering how it works within Tailwind, it is just a few keystrokes away. I wrote my PDF guide in a similar way too. So if you want to change the text color, super simple. You want to see which colors you have access to? Well, that's here too. Trust me, Tailwind is incredibly intuitive. And in just a few days, you'll be creating UIs like a pro without constantly peeking at the docs. It's all about practice and embracing that creative flow. And on top of that, no matter which editor you use, whether it's VS Code or WebStorm, which is a fully fledged IDE, you can install the Tailwind CSS official extension that will speed up the writing of your Tailwind CSS classes significantly. And if you're using WebStorm, you'll also get an extra edge with features like color previews for your theme and detailed information on each Tailwind CSS utility when you hover over it. So if you want to follow along and see exactly what I'm seeing, as of recently, WebStorm became completely free for non-commercial use. So I'll leave the link down in the description so you can download it. And that's it for the first part of our Tailwind CSS crash course. By now, you've got a solid understanding of Tailwind's core concepts, and you're well on your way to mastering utility-first styling. But we're not stopping there. In true JavaScript mastery style, let's take things to the next level. Next up, the build and deploy section, where you'll bring everything together by developing a stunning Fitness Pro landing page, a real-world project that puts your new Tailwind skills to the test. You'll build a sleek, fully responsive layout, dark mode support, and advanced styling techniques, a polished professional UI ready for production, and of course, we'll deploy it live so you can showcase it on your portfolio. So if you want to keep going, you can access the full build and deploy section along with structured lessons, interactive quizzes, and even more Tailwind deep dives over on JS Mastery Pro. Depending on when you're watching, you can join the waitlist or jump right in and start learning today. Links in the description, and I'll see you on the inside. With that in mind, thank you so much for coming to the end of this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day.